Yo, what is up YouTube? It's your boy Legend and I'm back with another video. New series. You already know what this is just by looking at the thumbnail. Now, if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe while you're at it. We're gonna go for 8 likes this video. 8 likes and you get next part. But without further ado, let's just get into this intro so we can start this what if.
Yeah, I put out all this art, it's my only medicine, yeah. Everything I do, I'm just being genuine, yeah. I'm sick of being screwed, feel my own adrenaline, yeah. I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah. I'm grateful, oh yeah.
I am truly sorry, Tanjiro-kun. I never expected this to happen. Tamayo was bowing an apology the next night as they all got up and started moving about, her flawless skin now having a bite mark on her shoulder and neck junction that was already scarred over, as if it were like a tattoo or an old wound. I know you didn't, Tamayo-san, and it's alright. I'm sorry that you're stuck with me now, Tanjiro said with a smile and an already scarred over bite mark on his own neck and shoulder. To repay her for her medical services, Tamayo had sent Yushiro and Nezuko to a different part of the house for them to gather supplies, and all which had intentionally trapped them there once the sun rose. The part of the house they were in wasn't hit by the sunlight at all, but there was now a large hole in the living room that let sunlight in and they couldn't get around it. The payment, as she had explained to Tanjiro, would be for him to help her through her heat. After all, despite knowing of Yushiro's adoration for her, she saw him more like a son since she had turned him herself, and besides, for some reason, it was worse on a female demon if another demon helped her through her heat, but normal humans couldn't survive it. Normally because they got turned into a meal halfway through, which made more problems than solved. And only demon slayers with their enhanced, well-trained bodies had a chance of surviving. The chance of finding a demon slayer who would be willing to help a female demon through their heat and not try to behead them, however, was next to impossible. So Tamayo had spent more than 400 years with no help at all with her heat, and then this kind strong slayer comes along and asks what he can do to repay her for not just bringing enemies to her doorstep, but also for causing damage to her property and for bandaging up his wounds. Yes, she had been embarrassed to ask this boy, especially considering he had agreed but mentioned that he was reluctant since they wouldn't be getting married, which had led to her telling him briefly about demon mates and how each demon knew their mates were human and would or had been eventually born, but most never found their mates, and the few that did usually killed them by accident when they were human. The very rare few that had demon slayers for mates had either been killed by their mates who had slit their bellies or by other demons for being a traitor to their kind. He had agreed to become mates with her, and she had explained that while it was a nice gesture, it wasn't so easy. After all, if just anyone could be a demon mate, then mating a demon had to both bite their partner and be bitten by the partner on the neck, and if they are meant to be mates, then the bites would scar over and remain on their bodies no matter what. Tamayo had fully expected the bite on her neck from Tanjiro to heal over in an instant and not scar at all. In fact, she had told him that he could bite her if he wished to see if they would be mates, but she highly doubted that they were, and that if they weren't, then while he had helped her through her heat, then he could not marry her. Of course, she had also had to explain that if she ever met her mate, then they would surely understand why she had let another have her body, so that was of no concern either. Fortunately, Tanjiro had a habit of defying everyone's expectations and causing the impossible to be possible or come true, as evident by the mate marks that now adored their necks. If anything, I'm afraid you're stuck with me. Demons, the lucky few who do find their mates, mate for life, and the first time a demon mate dies, whether from age or disease or battle, the mate becomes a demon as well. It's the only way for any demon to create another. Tamayo explained, and Tanjiro smiled softly at her and made sure she had plenty of time to pull away as he reached forward and grabbed her hands, pulling it up to his face and kissing her knuckles. She blushed rather cutely as she stared at him surprised. I don't mind at all. It's perfectly fine with me. Besides, we're going to create a cure together, right? So eventually, we'll either both be demons for a while and then human again, or we'll both be humans. Either way, there's nothing wrong, Tanjiro said as he gave her a bright smile that was filled with understanding and warmth. Tamayo stared at him surprised for a moment, and then she let herself smile softly. Yes, we're going to create a cure together, Tamayo said, and her smile wasn't one of her easy, long since perfected smiles. Not this one. This one was a truly genuine smile. You should smile like that more often. It suits you, Tanjiro said, grinning at her, and she blushed a bit, her hand coming up to her mouth, surprised and almost as if she was going to cover her mouth. Yushiro had arrived and either knew what they had been doing all day or had discovered what it was as he stared at the marks on their necks. Yushiro-kun. Tamayo's stern voice stopped him in his tracks just before he could attack Tanjiro. It seems we will be sticking together now as you travel, Tanjiro, Tamayo said as she kept her hand in his, squeezing his hand ever so slightly. His hands were rough and calloused, but they felt warm and gentle in her own. Right. So we either travel together at night or we find some way to keep you both out of the sunlight during the day that I can carry you if need be, Tanjiro said. He was trying to think of how to do so. After all, they wouldn't fit in Nezuko's box, even if they were in their small forms. Not all three of them, and he was reluctant to have Yushiro alone in a box with his sister. Then again, he was reluctant to leave any male alone with his sister. Nezuko made a noise, and when they looked over at her, she was pointing at a cart that had a roof on it and a door, but no windows or holes to let sunlight in. Good idea, Nezuko. They can ride in that, and I can pull it along as we travel. It'd be harder to do on the roads and unworn paths out in the city, but still possible, Tanjiro said, praising his little sister and giving her head a rub that she happily leaned into. That is possible, and it lets us carry supplies with us for if anyone gets injured, Tamayo said, smiling, as well as looking briefly surprised when Nezuko appeared before her, looking eager. She wants you to pat her head, Tanjiro said, making Tamayo nod slowly and reached forward, gently patting Nezuko's head while she gave a happy noise and leaned into it, much to Yushiro's jealousy. Nezuko, this is my mate, my wife. That makes her your new big sister, doesn't it? Tanjiro asked, and Nezuko's big round eyes went even wider as she made excited and happy noises before she immediately wrapped her arms around Tamayo, who looked surprised but smiled as she released Tanjiro's hand and hugged Nezuko back. We should get going before more demons come after us, Yushiro said, glaring and sulking and hating the mark on Tanjiro's neck. It should be on his own neck, not on that swordsman's. Good idea, Yushiro-kun. Nezuko-chan, do you want to ride in the carriage with us? Tamayo asked, smiling at the younger demon who tilted her head before she raced over to her box and climbed inside. I think you really like that box, Nezuko-chan. Tanjiro chuckled and Tamayo shook her head slightly in disbelief. before she left for a moment and returned with a pillow and blanket. Here, you could at least be more comfortable in there, Tamayo said, and Nezuko made a happy purr-like noise and nudged against Tamayo affectionately when the woman tucked the blanket in around and placed the pillow behind her head. We can walk while it's nighttime and just keep the supplies in the cart. We should leave, however, Tamayo said, and Tanjiro smiled at her as he hooked Nezuko's basket onto his back and then immediately picked up the ends of the wagon and lifted it to carry everything that Yushiro was quickly putting inside. Ready? Tanjiro asked, and Tamayo and Yushiro nodded, Tamayo placing a hand over Tanjiro's. Ready. No matter what came their way, they were ready to face it together. After all, Tamayo hadn't found her mate in over 500 years and had never expected to find him, but now that she had, she wasn't letting him go. Pardon me, Tamayo said as she entered the room that the three boys were relaxing in almost as soon as the sun went down. The boar-headed boy frowned slightly as he glanced at her and then looked away without really caring. Tanjiro was smiling as he stood up and moved to approach her, the metal band on his hand glinting in the light, and the sight of it never failed to bring a more genuine smile to her face. The blonde-haired boy in the orange robe, who had protected them earlier from the boar-headed one, took one look at her, and there were suddenly hearts floating around him, and he had gone kind of noodle-like. A pervert. Yushiro was right beside Tamayo like always, and he was glaring death at the blonde boy. After all, while he didn't like that Tanjiro and Tamayo were mates, he could admit that Tanjiro was a perfect gentleman and an attentive husband/mate for Tamayo. The last few days together had Yushiro's animosity towards the kind swordsman starting to fade away, seeing how attentive and caring he was towards Tamayo, and how he never forced Tamayo to do anything against her will, or if she was reluctant, then he never brought it up again. Tanjiro was not a pervert, and that made him much better than other males in Yushiro's eyes, certainly better than this blonde brat who had been begging a girl to marry him on the road earlier. Zenitsu. Tanjiro's voice was cold and stern, and when everyone looked at him, there was a cold smile on his face that sent shivers down his spine. Kindly don't flirt with my wife, Tanjiro said, his voice sounding light, but there was a hidden threat in it as he stared at Zenitsu with his eyes glinting darkly. Your wife? Zenitsu asked, torn between shock and disbelief, and being scared witless by the look in Tanjiro's eyes and tone of his voice. Let me check your injuries, dear, Tamayo said, having ignored the blonde as she approached Tanjiro and immediately took off the top of Tanjiro's sleep yukata to check his ribs. I know the human doctor checked them over, and it seems he did a good job wrapping them, but Yushiro-kun, can you hand me the bruise cream? Tamayo asked, and her assistant immediately fetched it from their supplies and handed it to her. Thank you, Tamayo said, and Yushiro had sparkles around his head, smiling happily at being thanked by Tamayo and thinking of how beautiful she looked, even though he knew she was taken. Here, this should help reduce the bruising and swelling and may help you recover faster, Tamayo said as she gently lathered the generous amount onto his skin. Thank you, Tanjiro said, smiling at her thankfully, and she was blushing slightly and averting her eyes. It's the least I could do, Tamayo said, smiling and blushing a bit when Tanjiro leaned forward and gave her a gentle kiss on the cheek. Here, you can both do your own, right? Yushiro asked, glaring at the other two boys and shoving some of the cream into Inosuke's and Zenitsu's hands. Thank you, Zenitsu said gratefully as he began to apply the cream to his two broken ribs. I don't need any medicine. Lady Tamayo made this medicine using her own two hands and supplies, and it is gracious enough to let you use it. You will use it, Yushiro growled as he forcibly put some on the poor boy who growled back, but honestly was too full and tired and confused about Tanjiro's reaction and all to care anymore tonight. Nezuko-chan, you're awake? Tamayo smiled while the younger demoness woke up and crawled out of her box, slowly growing from her tiny form into her natural size. Nezuko chirped happily and immediately raced over to Tamayo and Tanjiro, giving a happy noise when she was immediately giving head pats and rubs by the two of them. So, who's the other girl? Zenitsu asked, jealously, and wondering if Tanjiro had two beautiful women all to himself. Oh, this is my little sister Nezuko. Nezuko, that's Zenitsu-san and Inosuke-san, Tanjiro said, introducing his sister to the other two slayers, who glanced at her, and while Zenitsu went all noodle-like again, Inosuke merely stared at her before turning over on his other side and ignoring them all as he fell asleep. We'll be staying here until the three of us recovered from our injuries. Sorry, dear, Tanjiro said, and Tamayo merely smiled at him. You deserve a rest, love. Besides, you did very well taking out the former lower moon. His blood you managed to gather will surely help us make a cure, Tamayo said, and Tanjiro smiled brightly back at her as he put the top of his sleeping yukata back on before he wrapped his arms around her and laid down, pulling her down with him into his side. Tanjiro, Tamayo said, blushing in embarrassment and surprise while Tanjiro grinned at her, and Yushiro seethed so hard that he was nearly doing flame breathing. What? I want to sleep with my wife in my arms tonight. As long as you're okay with it, Tanjiro said, and his arms were loose around her so that she could easily slip out if she wanted to. I'm fine with it, Tamayo said, and she was blushing a bit and wouldn't look at anyone as she moved closer into Tanjiro's arms. I love you, Tanjiro said honestly, and he gave her a quick, gentle kiss. She blushed brighter and smiled genuinely as she nuzzled into his chest. I love you too, Tamayo whispered as she tilted her head so that she could give him a slow, loving kiss before Nezuko in her tiny form jumped on them, which made them separate a bit and laugh. You're just like a baby, Nezuko, Tanjiro said, smiling at his sister as she curled between them in her tiny form, and his heart warmed as he saw the soft, loving look in Tamayo's eyes at those words as she moved enough to let Nezuko be comfortable and comfy. She is. I don't mind, though, Tamayo said softly as she wrapped her arms around Nezuko, and her heart warmed as the girl snuggled into her while clutching both her kimono and Tamayo's yukata in her tiny hands. Tanjiro smiled gently as he stared at them. Tamayo, with her soft, loving purple eyes, as she stared at the tiny infant-sized Nezuko, who was curled between them. Nezuko, who was as tiny as Rokuda had been, and curling up in between him and Tamayo like Tanjiro remembered his siblings used to do with his parents when they were all young. He couldn't help but think of a small, dark-haired, purple-eyed little girl in Tamayo's arms one day. Or maybe the child would have his hair and her eyes, or her hair and his eyes. He liked that thought of one day having children with Tamayo. If she wanted children one day, then he would gladly help them become more than a dream and would keep them safe from anything and anyone. He'd fight anyone and everyone if he had to do so. But if she wanted a future with him that involved children, then he would fight anyone and kill Muzan with his own two hands if he had to in order to make that future come true. For Tamayo's thoughts, as she stared down at Nezuko, she remembered her own children from so long ago, the ones that she had slaughtered due to her hunger when she was first turned. She had never thought she would find love again. She never thought she deserved love. Then she had found her mate in the young demon slayer who had a demon sister. He'd do anything for her, and who had suffered so much at the hands of demons and yet felt compassion for them and empathy and didn't hate her and Yushiro for being demons. She had found a mate she didn't think she deserved or would ever find and gave her unconditional love and acceptance and understanding. Of course, she was doing her best to be a good mate and good wife in return, tending to his wounds and supporting him, and occasionally when they were able to, she would cook something and make sure he had fresh food to eat and train with him to make sure he was getting stronger so that she didn't lose him. He never forced her into anything and never pushed her for anything at all. He was more than happy to do whatever she was comfortable with and stay at that level. He gave her unconditional love with no strings attached, and she didn't feel worthy of it at one bit. Staring down at the tiny infant-sized Nezuko, who had quickly fallen asleep in the hold of Tamayo and Tanjiro, clutching at their clothes like a child would her parents, Tamayo looked up at his eyes and saw nothing but love and wonder and awe in them. As he stared at the two of them, and she blushed. She wasn't worthy of such a look, and yet he gave it to her without reservation. She wasn't worthy of thinking about a future with Tanjiro, of thinking of a future where they both could go into the sun, or of thinking of her stomach swelling with this child. A child born from the two of them and possibly having her hair in his eyes, or his hair and her own eyes. And she hoped the child would have his smile and heart. She wasn't worthy of thinking about such things, and yet she did. She was thinking of a future with her mate and husband, a future that involved children eventually, children that she wouldn't slaughter because she was different now. She didn't need flesh or anything, just a bit of blood that her husband was happy to give her himself. She wouldn't hurt her children this time. She wouldn't let her, even if her control somehow slipped and she reverted back to being a monster she used to be. She was far from worthy of it, but she wanted it so badly. She didn't care who she had to fight to make that future come true, but she would fight anyone. She wanted that future so much. Good night, Tamayo. I love you so much, Tanjiro whispered quietly as Yushiro stood guard over everyone while they slept. Chushimaru curling up in his lap for pets for a while. Good night, Tanjiro. I love you too, so very much, Tamayo whispered back with a soft smile, and Tanjiro gave her one last bright, loving smile before he drifted off to sleep, with her following soon after. Nezuko gave a happy purr between the two. She loved her big brother and big sister. She'd be happy to make sure that they could stay together and be happy. They both deserved it, happiness and love. She'd protect her brother and sister and their future happiness no matter what. Let's see this demon's true self, some asshole pillar covered in scars was saying as he splattered his blood on the box Nezuko was in until she popped her head out and stared at him. Leave my sister alone. She doesn't eat people or drink blood, Tanjiro said, even as he was pushed down in a way where if he tried to use any of the breathing techniques, his chest would explode. Then this should be alright then, right? The butterfly-looking lady asked, smiling coldly, but Tanjiro could smell the anger and hatred coming from her. And almost all of the pillars, as they all watched and prepared to strike Nezuko down, the moment she drank the Mirachi blood being shoved in her face. She instead made a annoyed noise and turned her head away from the blood, staring angrily at the person holding down her brother. She turned away from the Mirachi blood. The other pillars were stunned, while their hair of the head relayed what had happened to his father. Nezuko. Tanjiro was relieved and managed to buck off the pillar holding him down, thanks to the man's surprise and disbelief over Nezuko turning away from the blood. Nezuko curled back up into her box, sulkily glaring at the stunned pillars. but she brightened up and waved slightly at Giyu, who looked surprised but gave her a small wave in return. Pardon my intrusion. Tamayo, however, was entering the shaded part of the moon and rushed over to tend to the pillar's cut up arm. Despite the wisteria around here protecting you and the sunlight, you'll still attract many demons if you just continue to bleed. Tamayo scolded the pillar slightly as she began to wrap his wounds up and stop the bleeding. You're a demon! The man, what his name was, Tanjiro didn't know, and he didn't care. As he swung his sword towards her, pardon my rudeness, Tanjiro blurted out to Kaguya as he raced forward with the hilt of his broken sword in hand, and he intercepted the sword aimed at Tamayo. Doing so, he twisted his sword handle and what little was left of the blade down towards his own arm, so that it was what the pillar sword hit as Tamayo thrust his arm in the path of the sword. Ouch! Tanjiro winced a little bit as his sword broke further under the force of the blow, and some of the metal pierced his arm, but thankfully it had parried the other sword and caused the pillar to stumble back in surprise. His only warning was a flashing of split purple eyes before a slim foot slammed into his stomach and sent him flying back out into the other pillars, who had stood up in alarm. Nezuko was growling slightly behind her bamboo gag as she glared at them while standing protectively in front of her brother and his wife with her eyes slit. Are you alright, Tamayo? Tanjiro didn't care about his arm and the pain it was in as he stared at his wife, who was immediately treating his injuries as she pulled the shards out of his arm. I'm perfectly fine, dear, but you were injured just after such a rough battle as well. You know that blade wasn't aimed at my neck, so why did you? Tamayo trailed off as she stared at the slayers while he merely smiled brightly at her and leaned forward enough to give her a chaste kiss. Pillar or not, I'm not letting anyone hurt my wife, Tanjiro said as she blushed slightly but smiled. She was getting used to him giving her affection and kisses with others around. You should be more careful, dear. Neither Nezuko nor I like you getting hurt either, Tamayo said, chiding him slightly, while the pillars were all standing with swords drawn, but they were frozen as they stared at the couple. It's nice to finally meet you in person, Tamayo-san. I am Ubuyashiki Kaguya, the current head of the family of the Demon Slayer Corps, Kaguya said, turning slightly towards the Demon Slayer doctor. The demon doctor, who gave him a small smile and bowed respectfully. It's nice to meet you, Ubuyashiki-sama. You look a lot like your ancestor, pardon my intrusion, Tamayo said politely, and the man merely chuckled a bit. You are welcome here, Tamayo-san. I see that there is a lot between you and young Tanjiro-kun, and this explains Azaki-chan's report about how a purple-eyed demoness and a whitish-haired demon had to cut the strings holding her and some other captives before their necks were broken by the puppet master, Kaguya said, and Tamayo nodded slightly. I hope the poor dear is okay. I treated her broken bones as best I could at the time, but it was far from the best work, Tamayo said, looking concerned at Kaguya smiled. I have been assured that while there is some permanent damage in her offhand, her main arm and hand will recover completely in time. Unfortunately, some of the others were not so lucky, Kaguya said, and Tamayo closed her eyes slightly with a nod of her head. She had known upon seeing some of them that they were beyond saving, but it always hurt to hear it. I am sorry for your loss, Tamayo said, and Kaguya merely nodded his thanks. Boy, did you call that demon your wife? One of the pillars, a blonde-haired one, asked, staring coldly at Tanjiro and Tamayo, while Nezuko seemed to be calmed when her brother patted her head and jumped into Tamayo's arms in her tiny form. Tamayo and I are mates in demon terms, married in human terms. She is my wife and I am her husband, Tanjiro said without hesitation as he raised his head proudly and stared them down, his arm moving out in front of his wife protectively in case they attacked. You chose to. Becoming mates is not something done easily or lightly. A demon or demoness mate is always a human. However, since most demons eat humans, you can imagine why even those who find their mates often do not keep them. To even find your mate is a very rare and a very wonderful thing for a demon, especially one who does not eat humans. To even find out if you are mates, a human must bite a demon's neck, and if the mark does not heal over and vanish, then they are mates, and the demon must bite the human in turn. You can see how that causes a lot of deaths. Tamayo broke in to begin explaining things to the pillars. As she stepped up a bit and put her hand on Tanjiro's shoulder. Her wedding band was on display, as was the bite mark on her neck and the bite mark on Tanjiro's neck. We do not get to choose who our mates are. No one is quite sure how mates are chosen for each demon. We do not have any control over that at all. Just as a human doesn't either. Just know this, I do not like to fight as a rule. I am a doctor, not a warrior. That would not stop me from fighting to defend my husband. You do not understand just how all encompassing being mates is, Tamayo said, and her voice was cold as ice, but her normal smile was on her face and she stared them down. If anything were to happen to Tanjiro, then I will go berserk. I will hunt down the one who took him from me, and I will sadistically and gleefully show them just how big of a mistake that was. There would be nothing that would stop me from doing so either. And as soon as I was done exacting proper revenge on the one who took my mate from me, I would step into the sun with a smile on my face in order to end my own life and rejoin him in the beyond. Tanjiro is my everything and the only one who could stop me if I were to lose my way. Tamayo said seriously, and Tanjiro turned to look at her and then took her free hand in his own and brought her fingers to his mouth, kissing her knuckles to get his attention. And why should we not kill you both right this moment? The butterfly woman asked, staring coldly at them both with a smile on her lips and a sword in her hand. Trust me, it would be most unwise to pick a fight with Tamayo-san. Kaguya wisely advised his pillars while making sure his son was right by his side just in case. The minute you try to do so, you'd have to get close to me and cause me to bleed, which is a mistake since Tanjiro already saved all of your lives once today from that. Tamayo said coldly in return, and she could see the flesh of confusion in their eyes. My blood demon art is not one that can be turned off. My blood itself, as soon as it leaves my body, already begins releasing a mist of illusions that I use to weave my spells. They affect demons quite potently. However, just breathing in the fumes at all from my blood can be lethal for humans, even demon slayers. When Tanjiro intercepted the sword strike aiming at my shoulder earlier, he did it not because he didn't want to see me hurt, but also in order to save your lives. Trying to kill me would only release a potent blood fumes from my body, no matter where or how you cut me, and just a whiff would be enough to kill most humans, Tamayo said, and they all were wide-eyed at that. They stared at her looking a bit horrified, especially given how close she was to Kaguya and his son. Not just that, but I am older than any demon you all have faced in your lives. I am older than Upper Moon 1 and have had all those years to become stronger and wiser. I am not a fighter, but you do pick up some things over the years, Tamayo said with a cold smile. To them, while they were all wide-eyed, a few of them were even trembling slightly, Tanjiro being able to smell their fear and horror at hearing this information. Now, I'll leave you all to your meeting. Just remember what I said before you make any rash decisions, especially involving my husband. I'll have Nezuko-chan with me, Tanjiro, so don't worry about her. Tamayo said, looking a lot happier and fonder as she looked at her husband. Alright, dear, I'll find you soon as I'm done here. Be good for Tamayo, Nezuko-chan, Tanjiro said, smiling at her and giving her a quick kiss before kissing the top of his sister's head while she nuzzled him happily and then wrapped her deceptively small arms around Tamayo's neck. She's a perfect angel, and we both know it, Tamayo said, and Tanjiro chuckled slightly while she calmly walked from the room and Tanjiro stepped back into the yard. I apologize for her scaring and threatening you all. She is very protective, Tanjiro said, bowing slightly to everyone while they all stared at him with stunned eyes. Is all of what she said true? The pinkish-haired pillar asked, staring at Tanjiro, who chuckled slightly and rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. It is. She mentioned being there when Yoriichi nearly defeated Muzan himself, and how Yoriichi spared her because there was no need to kill her when she hated Muzan and wanted him dead just as badly, as if not more so than any demon slayer did, Tanjiro said, and he smelt their fear spiking. There was a demoness in their HQ who not just had a blood demon art that was lethal to anyone inhaling it, but also who was older and therefore likely stronger than Upper Moon 1. Fuck. If they set her off, then the devastation she could unleash was immense. Thank you for your time, Tanjiro-kun, and your report. I am sorry for how they treated your sister, but I'm sure if you two could take out the moons, then they may accept her as one of us, Kagaya said to the boy, who smiled brightly at him. And the pure sunshine behind it had all the pillars faltering slightly, and Kagaya didn't need to be able to see to also falter slightly under the sheer cheer of it. Don't worry about it, sir. I didn't expect them to accept her or Tamayo or even Yushiro immediately after all. Besides, I plan on killing all the demon moons and Muzan himself eventually. And as soon as Tamayo finishes her cure for demons to turn back into humans, things will be a lot easier, Tanjiro said, bowing to the man and then turning and leaving to find his wife and sister. There was pure silence behind them for a long moment. Then a shout of, "What do you mean, cure?" But guys, I'm going to end it off right here. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe while you're at it. But without further ado, I'm out, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.